my name is Luke Newton. I will be your next speaker. Are the judges ready? Is my timer ready? All right, then let's begin. Every time I go to church, it seems that all the pastor wants to talk about is money. Money, money, money. Well, this may seem to be the truth, but it's mostly because people can become defensive when talking about their pocketbooks. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about tithing. My goal today is to successfully illustrate to you that the act and concept of tithing fully applies to all Christians, although sadly, less than 5% of us actually tithe. Throughout my discussion, we'll be exploring three areas. First, what is tithing? Many people don't know what tithing is, how it started, or if we should even be doing it today. Secondly, look at the consequences in store for those who choose not to tithe. Oh yes, trust me, there are huge repercussions for choosing not to tithe. And for me personally, I don't want anything to do with those. Lastly, we'll look at the benefits in store for those who choose to faithfully tithe. When done biblically, there are huge blessings associated with tithing. To tithe or not to tithe? That is the question. Today, I hope to illustrate to you quite simply that while we may feel like we cannot afford to tithe, the exact opposite is the truth. We cannot afford not to tithe. Now, what is tithing? This concept is sensitive to many people for many reasons. Some people believe that tithing is a law-only concept. Well, God wrote the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, right? Well, in Genesis 14, over 500 years before the law was even written, we find Abram, not yet Abraham, giving tithes and offerings to an interesting character named Melchizedek, who just happened to be the king of Salem, soon to be called Jerusalem. We see that Abram is tithing to Melchizedek, which comes to show that tithing existed long before the law was even written. Now, when we see the word tithe, what does it mean? Well, the word tithe comes from the word tenth. In the Bible, God says that when we tithe, we are to give 10% of our increase back to Him. Now, what is increase? Increase is anything that we gain financially. That's pigs, goats, chickens. I'm just kidding. In our time, it's money. In the Bible, God says that when we tithe, we are returning to Him, not giving to Him. Wait, did I just say that when I'm tithing, I'm not giving to God? That's exactly right. Look at it this way. Let's say I come to you and I ask to borrow your car. You say yes and you give me the car keys. I drive to where I need to go, then I come back. Then I hold the car keys in front of your face and say, "Here are my car keys, you're welcome." Now, would that make any sense? No, because I'm not the owner of the car, you are. See, God already owns the tithe. In Leviticus 27, it says, "All the tithes of the land, the seed of the land, and the fruit of the trees belongs to the Lord. It is holy unto the Lord." See, God already owns the tithe. He just wants us to give it back to Him with a joyful heart. Now hold up a minute. Why does God want 10% of our increase? I mean, He lives in heaven with an army of angels and streets paved with gold. So why does He need us to tithe? You see, God doesn't need our money because He doesn't want our money, but He wants our hearts. God loves us with unending grace and wants us to demonstrate our love to Him by giving back to Him what is already His. Now, let's get into the consequences in store for those who choose not to tithe. In 1 Timothy 6 in the King James, it says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." Did you get that? The root of all evil is the love of money. See, God, already knowing this, wants us to tithe to show Him that we prize Him above everything. And notice that it doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. It says that the love of money is the root of all evil. And when we tithe, we're showing God that we love Him more than we love our money. Now, many people have many reasons as to why it is they don't tithe. Some say they don't tithe because they can't afford to tithe. Others say they don't tithe because they don't believe that tithing is for today, that it's an Old Testament thing. Others say they don't tithe because they just believe that their pastor is a crook and not to get their money for personal gain. At the end of the day, God commands us to tithe. And when we choose not to tithe, we're disobeying Him and leaving ourselves open to the consequences. Now, let's take a look at our average Joe. Joe loves Jesus. He attends church every week with his family of 4 and believes that he lives his life entirely for the Lord. The thing is, Joe and his family have decided they're not going to tithe because they can't afford to tithe. They live paycheck to paycheck, and if they were to tithe, it would put them in the red. Now, what Joe missed in his daily Bible study readings is that by him not tithing, he is unwittingly releasing what the Bible refers to as the devourer on he and his family's life. Now, I don't know about you, but that just doesn't sound very good. That random flat tire, that broken air conditioner, that missed job promotion, these are all strictly tied to Joe and his disobedience as it relates to him not tithing. Now, don't get me wrong. When I tithe, things will still happen, and bad things in this life can still happen. But when we tithe, we're removing a curse that is upon our finances. In Malachi 3, it says, "But you ask, how are you robbing me?" This is a group of people talking to God, and God replies by saying, "In tithes and in offerings. You are under a curse, you and your whole nation, because you're robbing me." Now, whether this group of people realized it or not, by not tithing, they were stealing from God. Now, would you knowingly steal from the creator of the universe? Absolutely not. And in this same passage, God goes on to say something that he says nowhere else in the Bible. As a matter of fact, he actually commands against it. He says, "Test me, and see if I will not open the floodgates of heaven and pour so much blessings on your life that you will not be able to store it. I'll prevent pests from devouring your crops, and I'll see to it that the fruit of your vine drops only when it is ripe." Fast forward 3,000 years from when this was written until now, and those pests that the passage was talking about come in the forms of the attack I mentioned earlier. We see that when we tithe, we're removing a curse that is upon our finances. Now, let's get into the blessings in store for those who choose to faithfully tithe. Okay, Luke, I get it. I see that I need to start tithing. But what's going to happen to me if I tithe? Well, let's take a look at our average Joe again. He and his family have just heard my discussion and have decided they're going to start tithing. But what's going to happen to Joe and his family? Well, just as I read in Malachi 3, the floodgates of heaven are going to open upon Joe and his family's life and pour so much blessings on them that they won't be able to store them. Now, before I continue, let me get this message across. We don't give to get. Many people tithe solely because they expect a bunch of blessings in return. Okay, God, here's 10% of my increase. When are you going to rain a bunch of cash on my life? See, God only wants our hearts. As an example of this, when my parents started tithing, they were completely broke and could not afford to tithe. But they knew that God called them as Christians to tithe, so they decided to step out in faith and start doing so. Fast forward 1 year from when they started tithing, and their income was multiplied dramatically. That is supernatural. We see that when we obey God and his commands, he will bless us abundantly for doing so. Now, in closing, I would like to address the tithing is for the Old Testament only argument. If we had somewhere in the New Testament where Jesus himself commanded us to tithe, I don't think any of us would disregard it, right? Well, that's the good news. We do. Most believers don't know this verse exists, but in Matthew 23:23 it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithes of mint, cumin, and anise, but have omitted the weightier matters of the law, such as judgment, mercy, and faith. These you should have done, and not left the other undone." See, what Jesus is saying here in red letters is that the Pharisees needed to do what they were doing in this specific area, but not leave the other undone, which was tithing from the heart. As I've stated all throughout this speech, God only wants our hearts. In Luke 16 it says, "He that is faithful with little will be faithful with much, and he that is unjust with little will also be unjust with much." In the context, those words little and much are actually referring to money. We see that when we obey God and what he tells us to do, he will bless us for doing so. Now, the message I'm trying to get across to you today is not to make you feel guilty, but it's to let you know that if you do tithe, God can change your life, and he will change your life. I promise. Thank you. Thank you so much for judging in time.